Stanford University.
Good afternoon or good evening. For those who did not have the opportunity to come to the reception last Monday, let me introduce briefly Juan Gabriel Vasquez. The LCL writer in residence, Colombian Juan Gabriel Vasquez, Bogota, 1973, is considered the best Latin American writer in his generation and has published several narrative and essays books in Spanish, among them The Informers, The Secret History of Costaguana, Los Amantes de Todos los Santos, El Arte de la Distorsión. I quoted in English those who has been translated into English. Some of his books have been translated into English, French, and German. The Sound of Things Falling will be released in the US on August of this year, but has been released in England, UK, this year, last September, sorry. A list of his books. Persona and Alina Suplicante are two books that he prefers to forget. Los Amantes de Todos los Santos, Alfaguara, 2001. Joseph Conrad, El Hombre de Ninguna Parte, 2004. Los Informantes, Alfaguara, 2004. La Historia Secreta de Costaguana, Alfaguara, 2007. El Arte de la Distorsión, Essays on Literature, Alfaguara, 2009. El Ruido de las Cosas al Caer, Alfaguara, also 2011. Juan Gabriel has published essays and book reviews for El Periódico, Letras Libres, Cuadernos Hispanoamericanos, Lateral, El Malpensante, Gato Pardo, El País, and some other journals. His books have been awarded several important international and national awards, and the most important, I believe, is the Alfaguara de Novela. Praise for his books are numerous, as well as book reviews of his books, which we can find in journals and the internet. I would like to thank especially Professor Gabriela Safran, Chair of the LCL and Director of Slavic Department, for her important, decisive support to this program. And Diane Berry Jakubowski, who has organized beautifully the program of the Writer in Residence. And now, let me tell you that this play will have 3 acts. In the first act, Juan Gabriel will read some pages of the English translation of The Sound of Things Falling and talk about this novel. In the second act, without intermission, I will make Juan Gabriel some questions about his life and work. As third and last act, we will dedicate a few minutes, very few minutes, to other possible comments and questions from the audience. So let's start with the first act.
When do we drink? When's this fourth act? Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Jorge, for your introduction. This time you did not mention your Swedish prophecy of last time, which makes me glad. So I'm going to read the first few pages of The Sound of Things Falling. The UK edition, as Jorge was saying, came out last September, and the American edition will come out next August. The first part of the novel is called One Single Long Shadow. The first hippopotamus, a male the color of black pearls weighing 1.5 tons, was shot dead in the middle of 2009. He'd escaped 2 years before from Pablo Escobar's old zoo in the Magdalena Valley. and during that time of freedom had destroyed crops, invaded drinking troughs, terrified fishermen, and even attacked the breeding bulls at a cattle ranch. The marksmen who caught up with him shot him once in the head and again in the heart with 3.75 caliber bullets, since hippopotamus skin is thick. They posed with a dead body, the great, dark, wrinkled mass, a recently fallen meteorite. And there, in front of the first cameras and onlookers, beneath a ceiba tree that protected them from the harsh sun, they explained that the weight of the animal would prevent them from transporting him whole, and immediately began carving him up. I was in my apartment in Bogota, 250 or so kilometers south, when I saw the image for the first time printed across half a page of a national news magazine. That's how I learned that the entrails had been buried where the animal had fallen, and the head and legs had ended up in a biology laboratory in my city. I also learned that the hippopotamus had not escaped alone. At the time of his flight, he'd been accompanied by his mates and their baby, or what, in the sentimental version of the less scrupulous newspapers, were his mate and their baby, whose whereabouts were now unknown, and the search for whom immediately took on a flavor of media tragedy, the persecution of innocent creatures by a heartless system. And on one of those days, while following the hunt in the papers, I found myself remembering a man who'd been out of my thoughts for a long while, in spite of the fact that there had been a time when nothing interested me as much as the mystery of his life. During the weeks that followed, the memory of Ricardo Laverde went from being a minor coincidence, one of those dirty tricks our minds play on us, to becoming a faithful and devoted, ever-present ghost, standing by my bed while I slept, watching from afar in the daylight hours. On the morning radio programs and the evening news, in the opinion columns that everybody read and on the blogs that nobody read, everyone was asking if it was necessary to kill the lost hippos, if they couldn't round them up, anesthetize them, and send them back to Africa. In my apartment, far from the debate but following it with a mixture of fascination and repugnance, I was thinking more and more intensely about Ricardo Laverde, about the days when we'd known each other, about the brevity of our acquaintance and the longevity of its consequences. While in the press and on the TV screens the authorities listed the diseases that could be spread by an artiodactyl, and they used that word artiodactyl, new to me, and in the rich neighborhoods of Bogota people wore t-shirts saying "Save the hippos." In my apartment, on long, drizzly nights, or walking down the street towards the city center, I began to think stubbornly about the day Ricardo Laverde died, and even to force myself to remember the precise details. I was surprised by how little effort it took me to summon up the words I had spoken or heard, things I'd seen, pain I'd suffered, and now overcome. I was also surprised by the alacrity and dedication we devote to the damaging exercise of remembering, which after all brings nothing good and serves only to hinder our normal functioning, like those bags of sand athletes tie around their calves for training. Bit by bit, I began to notice, not without some astonishment, that the death of that hippopotamus put an end to an episode of my life that had begun quite a while ago, more or less like someone coming home to close a door carelessly left open. And that's how this story got underway. I don't know what good it does us to remember, what benefits or possible penalties it brings, or how what we've lived through can change when we remember it. but remembering Ricardo Laverde well has become an urgent matter for me. I read somewhere that a man should tell the story of his life at the age of 40. And this deadline is fast approaching. As I write these lines, only a few short weeks remain before this ominous birthday arrives. The story of his life. No, I won't tell my life story, just a few days of it that happened a long time ago. And I'll do so fully aware that this story, as they warn in fairy tales, has happened before and will happen again. That I'm the one who's ended up telling it is almost beside the point. Thank you.
From now on, I will include Juan Gabriel among the writers who know how to read their books with a very nice voice, like an actor, because you cannot imagine how many poets and writers, novelists, destroy their works when they read them.
Pablo Neruda.
Pablo
Neruda.
Neruda. Oh, so I congratulate you. Now you can also work on the radio or on theater.
If anything else fails.
That's right. Now this is the first act. Now we're going to the second act. And I would like to start from the beginning and ask you if you can tell us how was the ambiente, the ambiance in which you were raised, and what took you to the literature, to the passion for literature in the family, in the society, in Colombia. How was your family?
Well, I grew up surrounded by books. That's maybe the first thing I should say. My family is a family of lawyers of a very strong humanist tradition. And so I grew up in a place where reading novels was not only something you did, but something important. You understood the world through novels. Novels were milestones through which you could understand your life. So I grew up with this idea that novels are important, that writers, good writers, are people you should look up to, and they were looked up to in my family. But the thing is, I cannot remember a moment in which I made the decision. I can't remember a moment in which I said, I want to become a writer. Maybe because I had always written. I can't really, literally, I can't remember a moment in my life when I wasn't writing. I wrote a little short story that was actually published in the yearbook of my school, so there's the proof for skeptics. I wrote it when I was 8. So I've always done this. This is something that has always been a part of my life. Reading and writing. There's something I told a British newspaper for the first time maybe a year ago. A little anecdote about my father commissioning from me a translation of a little book about Pelé, the footballer, that had been published when I was maybe 9. The Spanish World Cup was the biggest thing that could happen to a child of my generation. And the Spanish World Cup 1982 was on at that time. And my father had realized that football was the only thing that was interesting for me. And he said, well, the only way not to lose the poor guy to football is to make him translate a biography of a great footballer. So he managed, with that little act, to foster my love of the English language, my relationship with words, and my football fanaticism all at the same time. So yeah, he was smart.
Talking about football, I guess, which movie you are going to watch tonight. 3 Million.
3
3
million.
Million is a movie about Uruguayan soccer.
Yeah.
Okay?
So it's a short movie.
Yeah. Almost 3 hours. And that is about the Copa in 2010, when Forlan was declared the best player of the world. Okay. But now, okay, so the influence was more from your father than your mother, but both of them
They were both big readers,
yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it was.
Other brothers and sisters in your family?
Yeah, I have a younger sister, but she doesn't really care about books.
Okay.
No.
Wow.
I love her anyway, but you know.
Yes, yes. Now, then you went on to study something horrible, law.
Yeah. I will
Why?
never do that again.
Why? What happened in your life?
Well, well, my family happened.
Yeah, of course.
Family of lawyers, as I said, of a very strong tradition. I mean, not only my two parents were lawyers, but this uncle we all looked up to was an important lawyer. And this is what's important. At that time, in the late 80s, I finished school in 1990. At that time, you just didn't say, I'm going to become a novelist. This was not something you said in Bogota when I was growing up. Coming from a family like mine, so with this big law tradition, you follow that. Everybody was supposed to read novels and like novels. Everybody was supposed even to write novels in the weekends, maybe, or translate poetry or do something. But as a hobby, this was not something you did for a living. And so I started law school, and it took me 2.5 years. Right in the middle of my law studies, I realized that it wasn't a weekend thing for me. It wasn't a hobby. Literature was my way of being in the world. The only thing I knew how to do reasonably well was to read and write. And the only thing I was interested in was literature. So I decided I should finish law school and earn a degree, because with my degree I could leave Colombia and go study literature somewhere else. And this is what I did. I ended up graduating with a thesis called "Revenge as a Legal Prototype in the Iliad." I still wonder how I got that accepted, but this is what I did. I left Colombia in '96. I went to Paris to study Latin American literature and tried to build that space in which to become a novelist, to try to learn how to write novels.
When you went to Paris, you already had the idea of living for a long time overseas?
Yes. Yeah, the strange thing for me, as I remember, is why Paris? That's a big question, because I had grown up, I had attended an English-speaking school in Bogota. I didn't speak French, but I chose Paris. I felt that this was where you had to go if you wanted to become a writer. And you know, there were good presidents. The whole of the Latin American boom lived in Paris.
Before that, Rubén Darío, Horacio
Rubén
Quiroga.
Darío arrived in Paris in 1900. Some of my favorite novels, Joyce's Ulysses, The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway, were written in Paris. So the city seemed to have something. And Mario Vargas Llosa was a great name for me. He was a huge influence from the point of view of not only of his writings, not only from a literary point of view, but from the point of view of the ethics of a writer, how to be a writer, you know. You should devote your life to it. Writing is not something you do during the weekends. Writing takes up 24 hours a day. Everything that stands in the middle of your vocation should be ruthlessly eliminated. This is all Mario Vargas Llosa, his theories, his ethics and poetics. And I agreed. This was something that shaped my idea of the writer I wanted to become. So maybe this is the reason I chose Paris. And I went there for 3 years, and I discovered it was all a lie, a big fat lie. And Paris didn't make you a writer if you didn't have it in you. So after some time and some changes, I left, and I spent a very strange year in Belgium, and then I went to Barcelona to write my books.
Yeah, this Belgium thing, it was after some
The
woman.
Belgian thing.
After some woman or after Julio Cortázar?
No, yeah, no,
Julio
neither.
Cortázar was born.
He was born in Brussels.
Yeah, so.
No, actually, a woman would have been a much better
Romantic.
justification for a year in Belgium. But no, the thing is, I was going through this personal crisis with my life and my work. I had already finished my second novel, and was already dissatisfied not only with that novel but with the first novel, which I had published when I was 23. So I was really quite strongly doubting that I had it in me to be a novelist. So I had these friends in Belgium, an old couple. They were she's still alive. He's dead, but she's still alive, and she's the same age as Garcia Marquez. So that means 85. She was 70-something at the time, and I went to see them and told them that I wanted to leave Paris, but I didn't want to go back to Colombia. And they said, well, you can stay with us for the weekend and figure it out. And I stayed for 9 months. Yeah, it was their idea, I should say, so people won't be afraid to invite me over to their homes. It was their idea that I stay with them all that time. And it was the best year of my life. I mean, in terms of the discoveries I made, I decided I should marry my girlfriend. I decided what kind of writer I wanted to be. You have to discover that too. You have to discover the kind of writer you want to be. Because it's all there when you start. It's all there. You have all these possibilities, and you can actually become any kind of writer you want. And I think most bad books come from a bad choice at that moment. So all those discoveries I made when I was there in Belgium, including where to live. I chose Barcelona. I moved to Barcelona, and everything started looking up.
Now, Paris doesn't make any people a writer, but Barcelona, neither Barcelona.
Makes footballers.
But Paris was more for Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald, and Barcelona was for the boom.
Yes.
So you were also
Yes, I'm
looking
pretty sure.
after,
Yeah.
Vargas Llosa, Garcia Marquez, everybody was
Yes.
had spent some time in Barcelona.
Yes, I'm sure I had the Latin American boom in mind when I chose Barcelona. Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa,
Yeah, of course.
the publisher of all those guys, Carlos Barral. But I had the city in mind from a more sensible point of view, if you will. I mean, I chose Barcelona maybe for sentimental reasons. Yes, some of my admired novelists had lived there, but also for practical reasons. I knew that Latin American literature was well read in Barcelona, and I knew that there was a way to earn a living if I worked hard. As a writer, I don't mean from my fiction necessarily, but with literature. My dream at that moment, my big dream, was to earn a living through reading and writing. And that means translating literature, reviewing literature, teaching literature, whatever could be done with books or through books to earn a living. I wanted to do that. I didn't want literature to become something you do in your spare time and to have to earn a living, I don't know, through something else. And this is something the city gave me, and I'm very grateful for it.
No, I'm not so sure if Barcelona is in Spain, but
there are theories.
Anyway, there are lots of young writers who are living in Madrid or Barcelona or some other cities in Spain, and because we were talking about, well, I was talking about Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald, that they belong to the lost generation. Do you think there is a lost generation, Latin American lost generation in Spain, and because you are friendly with many of them?
Yeah. There's a big group of expatriate writers in my generation, that's for sure. But this was also the case for the Latin American boom. Again, we go to our models, to the beginning of our tradition. It's easier now to live abroad and to earn a living as a writer abroad and to write. But the difficult questions remain the same. What do you do with your country? For a writer, for a novelist, and for a Latin American novelist, somebody who writes in the tradition of Fuentes, Vargas Llosa, Garcia Marquez, place is very important. I mean, we have this fight going on. What should you write about? When I published my first book of stories, it was Los Amantes de Todos los Santos. It's a book of stories set in Belgium and France, the places where I lived. Everybody asked me, why? Why don't you write about Colombia? I mean, being a country with such great conflicts and full of narrative energy, full of things to be told, why don't you write about Colombia? But I guessed the real question was, what right do you have not to write about Colombia? You know, Latin Americans are supposed to write about their countries. Vargas Llosa about Peru and Carlos Fuentes about Mexico. And you know, the moment when I discovered this great essay by Borges, El escritor argentino y la tradición, the Argentinian writer and tradition. I thought, this guy has written this so that I can defend myself. This was an essay published by Borges in the 1930s, in which he said that Latin American writers have the right to the whole of the Western tradition, in the sense that they can write a short story that takes place in England, in which there are no Latin American characters, and they can write outside of the Spanish language tradition. They can write using Faulkner or Hemingway or Kafka or Camus as models. So this was a very good thing to discover, that I had a right. to write these stories set in Belgium and France. But still, the thing with my country kept nagging me, and I slowly began to understand that the reason I didn't write about my country was because I didn't understand it. I didn't understand its history or its politics. And I had grown up with this Hemingwayan tradition. The Hemingway tradition is write about what you know. So if you want to write about the war, you have to go and fight a war. Or if you want to write about fishing, then you should go and fish for 10 or 20 years. And then write your little novel. So I thought that if I didn't understand my country, if I didn't know this place I was going to write about, then I was not allowed to write about it. And it took me some years and some novels that I read, and the discovery of some authors, like Philip Roth was one of them, to discover Joseph Conrad was the most important of them all. To discover that not understanding my country was precisely the best reason to write about it. The idea that literature is a discovery, is an act of inquisition. You ask questions. You don't write because you know. You write in order to know. You write in order to find out. This is what I realized, and at that moment, I thought I'm allowed to write about my country. I'm allowed to write about Colombia. I'm allowed to treat Colombia as this dark place that I don't understand, but because I don't understand it, I'm going to write about it and try to find some things out and try to shed a little light in them, in those dark corners of our history, because essentially history became my subject, or rather the place where history meets private lives, private individual lives. This became my obsession, that crossroads. And I started writing about Colombia, and I haven't finished yet.
I agree with this sentiment of freedom of any writer to write about whatever they want, or stories, but you're still a Colombian.
Yes.
Writer, even writing about other subjects, the same way that William Hudson was British after writing on Uruguay, about Uruguay. Yes. Well, okay.
No, but this is interesting. But
yeah, I know that there is an issue to discuss. Yeah,
I've asked myself, why does it happen? Why do writers write about their places? Why does Faulkner write only about the South? Why does Philip Roth write only or almost only about Newark, New Jersey? And I've come up with a theory. I don't think it is because those are the things they know best. I think we novelists write about our birthplaces because those are the places that are surprising. That means those are the places that at some moment we thought we knew, but then something happens. You realize that a couple of blocks from where you were born, these terrible things had happened. Or you realize there's some dark place, dark moment in your history that you didn't know about. And the will to write about that comes from the contrast between thinking you know this place and the realization that you don't. This is not something that happens to you with other countries you've lived in. I mean, I lived for 13 years in Spain. I don't think I will write about Spain because Spain never gave me the feeling that I understood it when I was a child. I've always known I don't understand Spain. Nobody does. But since I never thought in the first place that I understood it, that contrast is not there. That surprise is not there. I don't know. Yeah.
I like this your response. Let me go from theory to practice, from practice to theory, and ask you this, very practical. When you started living in Barcelona, or traveling from Barcelona to other places, did you used to bring with you your wife and kids? Now, let me tell you this. I was planning not to make any question, any personal question, but since I read your interview with Jonathan Franzen, where he talks to you about his marriages, and other things very intimate.
You thought, hey, you can do this.
So I can do that. I can do that. It's not very intimate. But what about your traveling? Now they are in Colombia.
Yes. Yes, the girls still have to go to school.
Yeah. And your
against
wife
my
is a
bets.
writer? Because
No, luckily she's not, no.
Because in the case of Jonathan Franzen, she is a writer.
Yes.
And she published a book called Envy.
Yes.
Because it's envy between
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
lucky of you.
Yeah, no, we realized early on how lucky we were that only one of us was a neurotic. That's me, by the way. No, she's not a writer. She's very good, though, at building a place where I can write. Very understanding of the things I need, and so I'm lucky that way too. But yeah, we didn't come together this time, mostly because my girls are 7 and they have to go to school. So yeah.
So next time we'll
Next
meet
time.
her,
Yes.
your kids. And now this is a question also very intimate because it's about the language, your uses of English and Spanish. I remember that once at Stanford, Carlos Fuentes said that he could use English in almost everything except 3 things.
Yeah, I know that quote.
Huh?
I know that quote.
You know that? Can I tell
Yes.
the public?
Go ahead.
Okay, writing literature, insulting, and making love. So he needed to use Spanish for that. So, what is your relationship with these 2 languages? You are bilingual, so can you write, or do you find pleasure writing in English, or what is, yeah.
I've never written fiction in English. I've written essays. I've published essays in a couple of places in English, or reviews, but not fiction. No. What I think is that a language is like a toolbox. It's a big toolbox, and I have been collecting tools in Spanish all my life. So they're there. I have a reasonably big toolbox, and I know how to use every one of those tools. Writing in English is like, writing fiction in English is like using a deprived toolbox for me. I don't know all the tools. I don't know how to use them well. So, the risk is that what I build will not be as good as it should be. It's limiting. Many of the writers I love are people who have changed languages. One of the most important writers for me in my development, I think, is Conrad, who was a Pole who learned English when he was 16 or something like that. And he wrote some of the best novels of the English language with that 3rd language. Nabokov, obviously, is another case. Samuel Beckett. So these are all very interesting cases for me. These are people I try to analyze to discover how to do that. And what I've realized is that languages are not interchangeable in a writer's mind. That is, you cannot write the same book in two languages. Lolita is not a book you could have written in Russian. This is not a book for the Russian language. And I don't know if anybody has read The Defense or The Gift. These are books written in Russian that sound strange in English. You know that Nabokov had a hand at the translation, but you also know he might not have been able to write them in English. So this is something I don't I wouldn't reject in any way. And I love English so much. I think someday I will give it a chance. I maybe try to write something in English, write some fiction in English. But I know it will be the most difficult thing I'll ever do. Building a serious thing with half the toolbox has to be a very difficult thing.
Sometimes when we read your books or your short stories, we just read El Doble in class, or in Sounds of Things Falling. At you, Jamara, I mean, you imply that some of the characters are based on your life, because the characters were born the same year as you. They have published a book in such and such year, the same thing that you did. So why you use this autobiografía in your fiction?
Well, sometimes it's just because I want to reduce or eliminate the distance between, and it's a moral distance, eliminate the moral distance between myself and the subject. The narrator of The Informers is 10 years older than me, but when I wrote the novel, I tried to shape him in a way that resembled my own biography, certain aspects of my own biography, certain opinions I had, a general look on life that maybe we shared. And this is because the subject was very serious. The novel was born through a conversation I had with a German Jewish woman who came to Colombia in 1938 and who told me during a very casual conversation we had in 1999, she told me that after arriving in Colombia, her family had been persecuted by the Colombian government because they had a German passport, because they were German. And this was very strange, since Colombia was an ally of the Allies, and they were locking up Nazis and Nazi sympathizers. Colombia had a clandestine Nazi party in Barranquilla, in the Caribbean coast. And so the reason that happened was through one of these ironies, one of these big misunderstandings in history, by which these people who were German immigrants were considered dangerous because they were German. You know, doesn't matter that they were Jews and had fled Hitler and had fled Nazism. They were almost locked up in Colombia because they had the same nationality as the enemy. So this was the initial anecdote with The Informers. And I felt that if I wanted to write about such a serious thing that has been written about so many times, I had to close the distance between myself and the character and myself and the subject. This was not something I should do in the third person, writing about somebody else. The narrator should be somebody who resembled me. That was a way to say, I'm committed, I'm morally committed to this story. And in The Sound of Things Falling, it works a little differently. The narrator is 3 years older than I am, but we belong to the same generation. And maybe the reason that that book is written as it is because it's a generational book. The book tries to explore this. I realized halfway through the writing, tries to explore what it was like for my generation to live in Colombia, to grow up in Colombia during the years of the worst terrorist violence we have known in the 20th century. At some point, I discovered, this was very recent, I discovered that my generation was born at the same time as the drug trade. The drug trade really began in Colombia in 1970. In 1973, which is the year in which I was born, the DEA was founded. The Drug Enforcement Administration was founded. So this is the birth of the drug trade, those years. And those were the years in which my generation was born. And I was just wondering, what does that do to a generation? How does that affect a whole generation of people? What does it mean to grow up as the drug trade grows from being this minor smuggling of illegal substances to becoming the most dangerous, destabilizing, violent industry we have known. So writing in a way was trying to understand that. And since that question I asked myself had to do with my generation, well, then the narrator had to share some aspects of my biography with me.
But your generation was not so clearly aware of the trade.
This was also one of the themes of the book. Yes.
Yeah. For example, like the main character in your book, did you visit Escobar's zoo?
Yes.
As a child?
Yes.
When you were 8, 9 years old?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, I did. Pablo Escobar bought this huge property when he was coming up as a drug baron. This was a very big place, and it was so big that he had several landing strips for planes. He had I don't know. He had bull rings. He had
14 lakes.
See, lakes, huge lakes inside. I think there was even a river that was born and died within the property. And he had a zoo. He had a zoo that became for children of my generation, and afterwards became a tourist destination. Everybody wanted to go there. Everybody went there. It was free. And it was the only chance Colombian children had to see some animals, hippos and rhinoceros, a pink dolphin that Escobar had brought from the Amazonian River, a kangaroo that could hit a football. And so during those years, goalkeepers used to go to Pablo Escobar Zoo to get beaten by the kangaroo. There was a parrot who could recite the whole lineup of the Colombian national team. It was a magical place. So that didn't mean my parents agreed with sending their children or having their children visit the property of a mafia
That's right.
leader. So I had to do it behind their backs with a friend of mine. And it was an amazing experience.
And the zoo was in Medellin, or
The zoo
where
was
was it?
almost halfway between Bogota
Oh,
and
okay,
Medellin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I have a question, because I cannot avoid remembering a friend of mine who is alive, Gabo. I read an excellent essay that you include in your book of essays about the so-called influence of Gabriel Garcia Marquez on the younger generation. And I know that you feel very apart, very far away from realismo mágico, magical realism, or whatever. And of course, when we read your books, it's very different. It's not Garcia Marquez over there. But what do you think about Garcia Marquez's influence in because your thesis was that Garcia Marquez doesn't have an influence on the good writers, but on the bad writers. Is that true?
Well, the idea that I rebel against is the idea that influence in literature works in a territorial way. This means that if I'm Colombian and I'm a novelist, then I must have the influence of the last great Colombian novelist. It really doesn't work that way. And the best example that it doesn't work that way is Garcia Marquez himself. When he was growing up and trying to write novels and trying to learn how to write novels, there was no Colombian tradition to speak of. Good Colombian novels in the 1950s, in 1950, let's say, when Garcia Marquez started writing fiction in a serious way. Good Colombian novels were maybe a handful. And there really were not more than 5. I cannot think of more than 5 good, great Colombian novels written before 1950. There was no tradition. And so he couldn't learn from that tradition. And what he did, and this seemed almost a heresy at the time, what he did was say, well, you know, if I don't have these tools in my tradition, I have to look for them elsewhere. And he tells very good stories about the day he discovered Kafka, for instance. He had been writing little, almost folklore short stories. And then he discovered the Metamorphoses, and he read about this guy called Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one morning and discovers that he has turned into a giant insect. And he said, I almost fell off the bed when I read that. And he says that he remembers having thought, well, if you can do this in fiction, then fiction is something that interests me. And his first short stories are very Kafkian. But then he discovers Faulkner, and so he writes The Leaf Storm, I think the title is in English, La Hojarasca. which is the most Faulknerian novel ever written outside the United States. And then he discovers he needs an antidote for too much Faulkner. And so he reads Hemingway. And he learns how to write like Hemingway, and he writes No One Writes to the Colonel, which is almost a Caribbean version of The Old Man of the Sea, in many things. So he is the best example that this idea of territorial influence is just not right, because good writers don't passively suffer influence. Good writers know what they need and they look for it. They go and look for the influence they think they need in order to write this book they have in their head. Garcia Marquez realized that his Caribbean world strongly resembled Faulkner's South, so he hired, so to speak, he hired Faulkner, and he wrote like him. This is what I did. At some point I realized that the stories I wanted to tell, the things that obsessed me, or rather to write those stories that I wanted to write and to deal with those things that obsessed me, there was nothing useful in the Colombian tradition. Magical realism was not useful. It was something to be admired from a distance. And this is how I read Garcia Marquez, like a living classic, or rather like a dead classic in a way, because I read him as I read Salman Rushdie. Not that he's dead, but you know. So I deal with that idea of the influence in this way, of Garcia Marquez's influence in this way. The writers that were helpful for me were not in the magical realist mode, were not in the Colombian tradition. If we speak of the Latin American tradition, they were Vargas Llosa, Borges, Onetti, not Garcia Marquez. And the ones that were most important for me at key moments in my life were not even in my language, were Joseph Conrad, or Flaubert, or Faulkner even at some moment. And then more recently, Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, people like that. So at some point, I looked for those books, I hired these authors, I took out of them everything I could, and that's how my books are made.
Almost my last question is about your experience with, because you publish your books in Spain, and when you were talking about Garcia Marquez and no, en La Hojarasca, one of his novels were corrected. En La Mala Hora. La Mala Hora was corrected because in Spain, they thought that he was writing as a Colombian and he was not good Spanish. So I never got this edition because it was destroyed. It should be beautiful to have this edition. So what is your experience with your editors and agents and in Spain? Did they question you for any word, expression that they don't get? No?
Now, one of the reasons I lived happily in Barcelona for 13 years is that, as I said, Latin American literature is well read and well understood in Spain. Obviously, between 1962, when that happened, and now, a little thing has happened, which is the Latin American boom, which shaped a whole generation of Spanish novelists, like Antonio Muñoz Molina, for instance, who speaks beautifully about Onetti and about Borges. And now, in a sense, the tide is going the other way. One of the most important contemporary novelists, for me, one of the people who have taught me most, is Javier Marías, a great Spanish writer. No, on the contrary, I think that when Latin American writers of my generation complain that they are not well received in Spain and that the Spanish publishers don't look to Latin America, this is just unfair. Every Spanish writer of my generation has read the whole of the Latin American boom canon. Vargas Llosa, Fuentes, Cortázar, Garcia Marquez, Onetti, José Donoso, even Manuel Puig. They have all read every one of those people. But if you ask Latin American writers of my generation, who has read Juan Marcé, or Luis Martín Santos, or Juan García Hortelano, great writers, enormous, Juan Goytisolo. These are great, great names that belong in the same tradition as the Latin American boom. They haven't. So I think they shouldn't complain anyway.
Yeah. Well, I have questions for more than 2 hours more, but I think that you are anxious to go to the third act and make some questions to the writer, because I knew it.
So first of all, thank you for your visit and thank you for the interview. I wanted to ask another sort of praxis question about your writing. So you've mentioned that you hire these authors and you've mentioned their names, and you've also said that literature is an act of inquisition and you write in order to know, in order to find things out. But it seems to me that you also involve a lot of meticulous research in your writing. So I was wondering if you could say more about that process. I'm thinking in particular of La Historia Secreta de Costaguana, which bears an obvious influence of your work on Conrad. And it's very detailed in its historical sort of grounding. So if you could say more about how the research fits into your work.
Yeah, well, Il Doctorow, you know Doctorow, you've read Doctorow. He says that novelists who deal with history are just people who pretend there are more documents available than there really are. The process of research for somebody who works in this mode is basically making up documents and then acting as if you were writing nonfiction with those documents. This is what I try to do. This is just another way of saying that research is not that intense. It's not that deep. Fiction still is the basic thing, and the research is just a way of carrying that reality. Obviously, if you're writing about history, you have to. I mean, obviously, one of the things that every novelist has to do is suspend disbelief and convince the reader that these things could have happened. This is what novelists do. They don't convince you that these things are happening. They convince you that these things could have happened. I think that's an essential point to make. And this means lying about facts if you need to. This is one thing that is not always well understood. This right fiction writers have of distorting known history, distorting known facts, if it's for a good reason. An example would be Salman Rushdie writing in Midnight's Children about the murder of Gandhi. The narrator says at some point that Gandhi was murdered, and he gives a date. I can't remember which date. And 100 pages later, he says, oh, you know what? I've realized that I was wrong about that date. Gandhi was not killed that day, but some other day. And you know what? He says, in my book, Gandhi will go on being killed whenever I want him to be killed. I'm telling this story. I have the total power over this story. So in my story, the death of Gandhi will happen in this date. That seems frivolous or whimsical or whatever, but actually he's making a very good point about history. He is telling us, you have to always remember that history is a tale. History is something somebody is telling us, somebody told us. And that narrator who is telling history can make mistakes. That narrator is not objective. That narrator has an agenda, has a political agenda or a philosophical or a religious agenda. And so he is saying, always remember that everything is a story, and that what novelists do is basically claim for us, regular people, the right to tell our own story. So I think all that is contained in this very silly anecdote. The idea that if we are allowed to tell our own story, we are fighting against the powers that usually tell it. History is just a tale told by the ones who have won. This is a huge commonplace. But in life, I think we are always competing against big storytellers that are trying to impose their version of facts on us. The government is one of those storytellers. Just some years ago, Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan president, was digging up Simón Bolívar to demonstrate that he hadn't been killed by tuberculosis, but by the Colombian oligarchy. This is a rewriting of history. This is his way of saying, I want to tell you another story, and this is the one I will impose on you. Governments do that all the time. Religions do that. A religion is essentially a story we choose to shape our own lives. And that story is someone else's story. It has been told over the years. I think the great novelistic canon, the great novels, what they do is this. They give you another option to understand your life, another story. And I have no idea where I was going with this, but I'm pretty sure I answered your question in some way. Okay.
Sara es...
Well, first of all, muchas gracias por su sesión con nosotros.
Gracias.
También a Jorge por organizar todo esto. Pero so I had kind of two questions. One was in relation to location, and one was in relation to influence, because you talked about both. So first I was wondering, in terms of location, we actually have a little gathering of Latin American theory. And the last session we talked about Paris, not France, as this location of the arts or the letters. Yes. Where lots of writers and artists get gathered, and that's where their inspiration comes from, and this is where, and it's always been represented as kind of like this milieu of lettres, right? And so I was wondering if, you talked about Belgium, you talked about Barcelona and Paris as being like these places where you initially started writing. I was wondering if you could learn about Colombia and you can learn about other places in other spaces that were Europe, and would your literature turn out to be somewhat different, and what kind of influence the location has, like the space?
Yes.
And second, you talked about influences, and I was wondering what role do women writers play in your influences, especially because in the Caribbean region, I mean, there's just an emergence of very famous writers, and talk about identity and all that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Okay. Women writers of the Latin American tradition have not had such a great influence on me, no. I teach a course on the Latin American boom in Spain, or rather I taught, because I've left now. And it was a course taught to American students. And the first question, invariably, the first question I got was, why do we have no women in this course? Why? What happened in the Latin American boom that women are just not there? And it's a very good question. I don't know why that is. I know that when these guys began writing, they were great poets, great poetry written in Latin America by women. But there were many issues involved in the moments of the Latin American boom. Not all of them literary. There were political issues. There were social issues. Some even say that the Latin American boom is a political phenomenon, not a literary phenomenon, because it wouldn't have been born without the Spanish Civil War, 1939, and Spanish exiles going to Latin America and publishing all the great fiction that they were not allowed to publish in the Franco regime. So from a point of view, that started the Latin American boom, etc. So if you ask me about women, I think about Virginia Woolf, who was very important for me at some point. My first novel is hugely indebted to The Lighthouse. And I think she's one of the most brilliant essayists in the language. Right now, I cannot begin a short story without thinking about Alice Munro, or Catherine Mansfield, for that matter. So yeah. What was the first question? Oh yes. So I cannot prove it, but I'm absolutely sure that I wouldn't have been able to write about Colombia if I had stayed in Colombia. This is something I have always thought. I needed to go out. I needed to look at my country from a distance and realize from a distance what I was saying before, that not understanding my country was not a literary sin or a shortcoming or a fatal shortcoming, but instead was the best reason to write about it. I had to spend 6 or 7 years abroad to realize this. My literature has been influenced by a certain mixture of languages. I was referring before to language as a toolbox. I think you can also think about language as a bag you carry in your travels, and you fill it up with things. You fill it up with everything you can find. And so I found things in English, in the English language, both in the American tradition and in the British tradition, and even in the Indian tradition and in the Australian tradition. There are writers that I admire. I have translated from the English and from French big important writers. I translated a little book by Victor Hugo from the French, and I translated E.M. Forster from the English and John Dos Passos. And I think all of those things are mixed up in this big bag, in this big rattle bag. Also, the fact that I spent 13 years in Spain. And so my Spanish has been contaminated, luckily and happily, has been contaminated through the contact with the Spanish the peninsular Spanish. All these things I regard as ways to improve and enrich the contents of my bag. And that wouldn't have happened if I had stayed. So yeah, those places I have lived in have been very important for me.
Cynthia?
That was
Yeah,
what I was going
thank
to
you.
ask. Flannery O'Connor says that of all the arts, perhaps writing is that which is most tied to place. And I very much appreciated your very nuanced discussion of how place has factored into your writing, and precisely how I feel sometimes that we need to leave a place in order to be able to see it for the first time. That in a way, the most difficult thing is to do what somebody like Flannery O'Connor or Faulkner does, to write about the South in the South.
Having never left.
It's very
almost,
difficult
yeah.
to get, I mean, they're the exception in a way. There are many poor writings about place, but there's not that distance. And in the same way, people who write about a non-native place and never really know it deeply, and so, I mean, obviously both can be done well, but those are the exceptions, and I feel that precisely moving allows you to see things in a new way. I think about poetry too, and how poets who are not normally formal poets will turn their poems into form to write precisely what they would never otherwise write, and then they take it back out of form, and it's this kind of pendulum activity of back and forth between form and non-form. So place and non-place, and that gives you the right distance. So you talk about moral distance, there are all kinds of distances. And so I'm also, I think, you know, I wonder, have you ever tried to write, I know you said you haven't published a short story in English, but it seems to me that the exercise of writing in a language that is not your first language, perhaps, also gives you that new distance on your own language that you maybe prefer to write. And again, obviously, some of the best writers have been able to write in languages that were not their own, including poets, you know, Joseph Brodsky, Nobel Prize winner. So, yeah, I wonder, I mean, do you ever try to write in English in a literary fashion?
That's very difficult to say, because
Even if you've not published. But
Yeah,
do you
I have
that
begun
exercise?
things. No, I have begun things, but writing fiction is exhausting for me. It's writing a long novel. If you take it seriously, if you don't follow a paint by numbers theory, if you try to create something that wasn't there before, which is what Faulkner said fiction should do, it's a terribly demanding thing. I have the deepest admiration for writers of big monsters, such as I don't know, anything from War and Peace to 2666, Roberto Bolaños' last novel. Those things are exhausting, but they are intentionally baggy. They lack form, which is another one of the sources of exhaustion a writer has. So to write a 500-page novel, shorter than these novels, but to make it structurally perfect, such as Madame Bovary or Henry James's novels, or American Pastoral by Philip Roth. This is something I deeply admire, because it's mentally exhausting. It's mentally and emotionally and morally exhausting to write something like that. And so, if this little book, if The Sound of Things Falling, which doesn't reach 300 pages, took me 2.5 years to write and many headaches, I can't imagine what it will be like to write it in English. That's as close as I can come to I don't know, mental exhaustion. So for some reason, for some emotional reason, I know that's there for me. I know I will end up writing in English, something, because I just love the language so much, and its writers. But that will take up a lot of time, and for some reason I'm always writing a novel in Spanish, even in my head. Between books, I'm writing the next one, and it's in Spanish, the damn thing. So it will come. It will come. I don't. It's just that I don't see the moment.
One last question for Marilia. Okay, two last questions. Marilia.
Okay, thank you. If possible, could you describe some of your practical techniques of writing fiction or essayism? You can choose one kind of example. It's a short question.
Do you think it's a short question? Well, you know, the cruel thing about this trade, and this is what I always say to younger writers who come up to me and say, and they want to know how to become writers and if they should become writers. And I always say that the cruelest thing about the writing trade is that you never learn from it. I mean, a novel, also a short story, but I don't think that's as clear as with a novel. But a novel, if you take it seriously, is this game you have to write with rules that you don't know. You have to discover how to write this novel as you write it. And writing a novel is essentially discovering how to write that novel. Your next novel will be completely different. What you learned about the trade through writing the first novel will be of absolutely no use. And you want to kill yourself. All that work and for nothing. I mean, every carpenter learns a little bit more about his trade with everything he builds. That doesn't happen with novelists. They just learn to be more and more patient with the idea that there's nothing, that they cannot take advantage of the inertia.
Do you write every day? When you
I write every day. I write every day. I'm a morning writer. I've discovered, and this is a theory that has not been proven wrong to me. I've discovered that usually morning writers work with plans. They have fixed plans for their novels, all these little cards. And night writers, they just let themselves go and they have absolutely no idea where they're going. I'm a morning writer, but I have a tendency towards the night, which is a very elegant thing to say. So yes, I write every day, and I try to keep the same times. A very important thing Hemingway taught us was that you should stop working whenever you know what will come next. So the next morning you can start by just filling up the sentence, and maybe with any luck that sentence will carry you to the next sentence and to the end of the paragraph. Because otherwise the idea of waking up and facing this blank space and not having absolutely no idea about what will come is just dreadful. So this is a little technical trick. I am terribly aware about music, about the music of the sentence. This is not something I would wish any writer. And I've learned that one of the ways to help me write a novel is to choose another book, which is more often than not a very important book from the contemporary canon, so to say. Maybe something written after 1930 or 40. And so each morning I read the same pages from that book. And that works like a diapason. Can somebody give me the word? That little fork in music where you, tuning fork. That works like a tuning fork. It can be Juan Carlos Onetti, it can be Proust. I read the same pages every morning, and that gets some music running in my head, and that's how I write my pages. So these are little things you learn, and that work from book to book. Huh? Yeah. You don't have to relearn them for every book.
It is important to work in the morning because after lunch is siesta.
Yeah.
Yes.
And after
You learned that in Spain.
dinner
Yes.
is a movie.
Yeah.
So mornings. Okay, Marcela.
Yeah, I had two things to say. Well, one is a question, the other is more of a comment that we can discuss. Maybe you won't like very much my comment, but we can talk about it. My question is, speaking of structure, I did notice in the two books that I've read of yours, the El ruido de las cosas al caer and La historia secreta de Costanagua, I did notice a pattern maybe in both of those novels, in which you have two characters who have this like very momentarily encounter, and that encounter somehow changes the life of one of them, but it doesn't seem to change the life of the other one for some reason. And I just wonder if that's intentional, or if it just happened, or if it repeats itself in other of your works. Because I found it very interesting. And my comment though is that
I will answer the question, because if I don't like the comment,
okay.
maybe I will refuse to answer the question.
Okay.
I have just realized that the Informers works in the same way.
Okay.
In the Informers, there's also such an encounter. And I think that the reason behind that is that these are novels that work as investigations, in a way. These are novels in which a character tries to learn the truth, or tries to learn about the past, or the hidden facts, or whatever about somebody else. And this, I know, they're built like this because this is how I work in life. My relationship with life is this. As I suppose every novelist is, I'm curious about people. I want to know about people. I want to know about their lives and their little mysteries and their secrets and their things. And I behave, I try to make my characters behave with their stories as I behaved with the original inspiration. The Informers is based on this Jewish German woman that I was talking about. I interrogated her for 3 days nonstop to get the material for the novel. But I didn't ask all those questions because I wanted to write a novel. Not only that, I asked them because I wanted to know, because her life was immensely interesting for me. Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian poet, says somewhere that the birth of the novel was when we decided we had to replace the biographies of saints with something. Biographies of saints belong to a certain moment in history, and at some point, probably the Renaissance, people started getting more interested in other people than in saints. And so novels do this. This is what Osip Mandelstam says. He says novels were born when we decided that the life of the guy sitting next to us was worth exploring and narrating. So this is what I think is behind that structure. But I agree, it's the same structure. Everybody in my novels, every narrator in my novels is trying to find out something that happened in somebody else's life. It's because that's how I behave. And the comments.
My overall comment is I think you're a brilliant writer. I absolutely love the way you write. Something particular did happen to me when I was reading La Historia Secreta. That didn't happen when I read El Ruido de las Cosas al Caer, and that I did find some Garcia Marquez in your writing in the best possible way.
No, yeah.
I know because I've heard you and I've read some of your interviews that you want to distance yourself from the influence of Garcia Marquez, which I could not understand more. But it made me wonder, not about your writing, but it made me wonder if it's really possible to write about the Colombian Caribbean and not resemble Garcia Marquez at all, because it seems like an impossible.
Well, I'm glad that you came up with this, because it allows me to talk about something that I should always talk about after saying all those things about Garcia Marquez and his influence. And that is that when I began writing The Secret History of Costaguana, I realized I was writing a book about the Caribbean, the Colombian Caribbean, and the 19th century. And this is basically his territory. I mean, Love in the Time of the Cholera, at least 3 or 4 chapters in 100 Years of Solitude, and many stories are set in the Caribbean coast in the 19th century. So, among all the ways of doing this, I chose, I think, the most difficult way, which was to write a fiction that wouldn't run away from Garcia Marquez, but would try to use some of the same tools to just get in the ring with him and fight a little bit. So if you read the novel not that long ago, you will remember that at some point the narrator, who is telling his story from the year of 1924, he says to the reader, "Don't worry, reader, this is not a novel, this is not one of those books in which beautiful women fly in the air or yellow butterflies come flying." In 1924, so he's talking about a book, 100 Years of Solitude, published in 1967. Obviously, that's not possible. But in my book, it's possible because I wanted my narrator to fight with Garcia Marquez and his language and his images within those images and that language. Not run away, which is what I did in The Informers, try to write a prose and a kind of book that were essentially the opposite thing from magical realism, but try to go in the ring with magical realism and address it.
Does that make you his precursor?
Ah, very nice. I will quote you on that. Very nice. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, we thank you very, very much for
Thank you.
this evening. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.